I'm Sarah Jones, 49, and I went from a child who learned to take up less space to a 2-star Army Major General commanding a joint cyber intelligence division. For years, I stayed loyal, made the calls, wrote the letters, and showed up for the family that rarely showed up for me. But when my own mother pulled me aside at my brother's ceremony and told me not to disgrace them, I finally made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been overlooked by someone you gave everything to? Tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being made small, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, self-worth, and finally choosing yourself. What happened next might surprise you. My father didn't argue on his way out. He picked up the bag, looked at me over his shoulder, and walked to his car. I was 9 years old. I remember thinking, so that's how it works. You leave quietly or you don't leave at all. I filed that away and didn't know for another 30 years that I'd been living by it. The year was 1985, and my mother's name was Eleanor Jones, and she was 34 years old. She offered me an explanation that amounted to, "This is how it is now." My father, Raymond, wasn't cruel. He called every week and he would keep calling, every Sunday, same as always, his voice coming through the receiver like something reliable you could set a clock by. But the household had permanently reorganized itself around Eleanor's gravitational center. And everything that came after, every dinner, every silence, every adjustment I made to take up less room, followed from that single afternoon. I was 9 years old, and I was already learning how to require nothing from a room. What I absorbed wasn't taught directly. My mother didn't sit me down and explain that self-sufficiency was survival. She modeled it without knowing she was doing it. When she was under stress, she turned inward. When she was overwhelmed, she went quiet and managed and got through it. And what she communicated without words was that needs were inconvenient things that better people didn't have. The child who made the fewest demands was the easiest child to have around, and so I became that child, not because I was told to, but because I was watching and I was fast. I learned to read the emotional temperature of a room before I stepped into it. I learned to calibrate. I learned that the question of whether she is okay was never really about me. 5 years later, in 1990, Eleanor married Dennis Caldwell. He was 9 years younger than her, polite in a steady and undemonstrative way, and clearly committed to her in a fashion she responded to immediately and completely. I watched my mother transform around him. She was lighter, more open, more available in ways she had not been available to me in the years I was her only child and, by my accounting, her entire household. She smiled differently in his presence, a loosening I hadn't seen before, a quality of being held that had not previously been on offer. I was 14 years old. I registered all of it without resentment and without the vocabulary for what the observation cost me. Dennis wasn't cruel. He was simply chosen. And you could feel it the way you can feel any preference, not in what is said, but in what is available. The attention that flows in a room is not invisible. Even at 14, I could trace it. I learned early that I was someone my mother admired the way you admire a building. From the outside, occasionally, without going in. She didn't mean it as a slight. That's the part that took me the longest to sort out. The absence of malice made it harder to name, not easier. A villain would have been simpler. What I had instead was a mother who genuinely loved me and genuinely could not hold the space. A combination that took me 27 years to separate into its component parts. In the fall of 1994, I enrolled at a state university in Virginia on an ROTC scholarship. 4 years of college, 4 years of military training, and in May of 1998, I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Army at age 22. Eleanor attended the ceremony. She took one photograph. She hugged me briefly in the receiving line, her hand on my arm for exactly the duration that was polite. That evening I called home, and she congratulated me in a single sentence, then pivoted. Dennis's son from a prior relationship had just been accepted to a good college. I said that was great. I meant it, and I held the phone for 8 more minutes while Eleanor moved on to the son, the college, the specific detail of what the acceptance letter had said. She did not return to my commission. I was 22 years old. Dress blues, still creasing my shoulders, the fabric stiff and new and exactly right. My mother's longest comment about the day was that the ceremony looked very official. Then she told me about someone else's kid. I said that was great. I meant it. I also noted it. The way you note a crack in a wall that isn't structural yet. the way you note things when you are young and still expect them to correct themselves. In August of 1996, 2 years before I commissioned, Eleanor had called me during finals week to announce she was pregnant. The call was brief and practical. I drove home the following weekend after the baby arrived, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, Eleanor's jaw, Dennis's eyes. I held him in the hospital room, this small and furious and entirely unaware person. And something in me shifted without announcement. I was 20 years old, already in uniform-adjacent training, and entirely unprepared for the force of this small person who had just shown up and grabbed my finger. He grabbed my finger and I thought, I'll protect this one. Not because anyone asked me to. Not because I was the older sister and that was the job. Because he was small and entirely dependent, and I knew, even at 20, what it meant to be overlooked in that family, and I wasn't going to let it happen to him if I had anything to say about it. I didn't know yet what that would cost me. I thought I was choosing to give. I didn't understand that I was starting a debt Eleanor would never acknowledge, and Tristan would one day try to repay in a way I never saw coming. His name was Tristan. He was my half-brother, same mother, different fathers, and he would grow up 20 years behind me, which meant he would grow up watching everything. I didn't know that part yet. After I was commissioned, I established a ritual. I called every Sunday. I sent birthday cards that arrived on time, handwritten letters from every duty station, Fort Lee, Fort Huachuca, eventually Fort Meade. I took leave twice a year and drove to Virginia. Each visit, Tristan ran to the door before Eleanor could get there. He knew my voice from the phone before he knew my rank, which was the order I preferred. Every Sunday for 7 years. I made sure he knew my voice before he knew my rank. I sent him a postcard from every duty station, something with a picture on the front that a small boy would find interesting. A cactus, a satellite dish, a building that looked like something from a movie. He was 9 years old when I got my captain's bars, and I called to tell him first. He asked if that meant I was in charge of people now. I said yes. He said good. That was the right answer. I didn't know then that he was paying closer attention than anyone else in that family. I found out later. We'll get to that. Eleanor mentioned these calls occasionally and appreciatively, but she didn't sustain the acknowledgement. The calls were taken as given, part of the infrastructure of the household, like the heat coming on in winter. I was the reliable one. The assumption that I would continue to be reliable was itself a form of being overlooked, though I didn't have that language for it yet. What I had instead was a ritual I had chosen, and a boy who ran to the door, and a phone line that connected us across whatever distance the Army had put between us that season. The bond I was building with Tristan was mine. It wasn't something Eleanor orchestrated or sponsored, or even particularly noticed as a project underway. I wrote the letters because I wanted him to know my world. I called on Sundays because I wanted to be a consistent voice in his. He received them more fully than I ever knew, as it turned out. What this part of the story is, before anything else, is the record of what I chose before any of it was required. Before the ceremony, before the stars, before the back row in the lobby and all of it. This is the part where I chose Tristan, and he chose me back, and Eleanor set the table behind us and was close enough to hear and wasn't listening. Already somewhere else, always already somewhere else. Across 15 years, from my promotion to major through my promotion to brigadier general, the pattern clarified itself one incident at a time. No single incident was enough to constitute a break. They accumulated the way quiet injustices always do, unannounced, habitual, woven so deeply into the fabric of a relationship that they become the relationship itself. By the time I had a name for it, I had been sustaining it for 2 decades, and it had the feel of something structural, something load-bearing, something you don't remove without consequence. In 2007, I was selected for promotion to Major, 04, a competitive board, a meaningful career marker. I had been at Fort Meade long enough to know what the selection meant in real terms. Fewer than half the officers who came up for major selection made it through. And the ones who did were specifically chosen, not simply senior. I called Eleanor from my office. I told her I'd made major. She said, "That's wonderful, Sarah." Then she spent the next 12 minutes describing Tristan's performance at a middle school track meet, the split times on his 800-meter run, his placement among the other competitors, the specific comment his coach had made afterward. I stayed on the line. I said the right things at the appropriate intervals. I hung up and sat with it, I called her from my office at Fort Meade. I told her I'd made major. She said, "That's wonderful, Sarah." Then she told me about Tristan's 800-meter time. I hung up the phone, and I sat there and I counted. 1 sentence for me, 12 minutes for an 11-year-old's track meet. I didn't say anything. I added it to the column I wasn't keeping yet. The column. That is what it became over time. Not a grievance list, not a prosecution brief, but a running tally my memory was keeping on its own, without my explicit instruction. Each entry was small. Each entry had a perfectly reasonable explanation. Together, they were a portrait. In 2012, I was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, 05, a landmark rank, the first rung of what is called Senior Field Grade, a competitive selection that fewer than a third of majors ever reach. That same year, I missed Tristan's 16th birthday due to a mandatory training rotation I could not leave. I had mailed a card and a gift, both of which arrived on time, 2 days early in fact, because I had planned for the mail and the weather and the distance. Eleanor called to inform me that Tristan noticed I wasn't there. I explained the rotation. She said, "There are always rotations, Sarah. At some point, the family has to come first." She was right that he noticed. She wasn't right about why. Tristan noticed I'd sent the card 2 days early so it would land on time. He noticed the planning behind it, the forethought that a rotation schedule required. She didn't. My lieutenant colonel promotion was not mentioned in that call. Not once in the full length of it. In 2016, I was promoted to Colonel, 06, Full Bird, a distinction that fewer than 10% of commissioned officers ever reach in an Army career. It is, in most practical senses, the last rank you achieve through merit alone before the calculus of promotion shifts toward something larger and less personal. I had given 22 years to get there. In the same month, Eleanor called to tell me that Tristan had enrolled in Army ROTC at his college. Her voice carried the specific quality of pride she reserved for news she considered landmark, a brightness in the register, a particular enthusiasm I had learned to recognize, and that I had rarely heard directed at me. She described his cadet uniform. She asked if I could give him some advice. I mentioned the colonel promotion, almost in passing, because that was how I had learned to mention my own milestones, sideways, quickly, in a way that asked nothing of the listener and therefore could not be refused. 22 years in uniform. Full Bird Colonel. She called to tell me my 20-year-old half-brother looked sharp in his cadet greens. I told her to have him call me. He did. She forgot to mention to him that I'd just made colonel. He found out 3 months later when he visited Fort Meade. He was embarrassed for both of them. I told him not to be. It wasn't his to carry. In 2020, I was promoted to Brigadier General, 07, flag rank, 1 star, the threshold that separates senior officers from general officers, and that most people who put on a uniform at 22 never come close to reaching. The ceremony was formal and attended by my professional world, colleagues, peers, the people who knew what the rank represented in concrete terms. Eleanor was not present. She had cited a scheduling conflict. I called her that evening, as I always did, because I always did. She said congratulations, and then, without pause, mentioned that Tristan had recently received his commission as a second lieutenant. Both pieces of news in the same breath, at the same register, in the same tone. The call lasted 4 minutes. General officer, 1 star, 22 years of consecutive service. My mother gave it 4 minutes, the same 4 minutes she gave Tristan's commissioning. I don't think she knew what she was doing. That was the part I kept coming back to in the weeks after. Not malice. The absence of the thought at all. The fact that she had no frame of reference for what flag rank meant in real terms. And so the promotion and the commissioning arrived as 2 military things, both worth noting briefly before the call moved on. By 2022, I was assigned to Fort Meade as the commanding general of a joint cyber intelligence division. That was also the year Colonel Diane Marsh, born November 8, 1974, 06, my peer at Fort Meade and the closest professional confidant I had developed in a career of careful professional distances, began to notice something I had been carrying so long I had stopped registering it as weight. She didn't announce her observation. She watched first. Several deflated post-call versions of me, walking back to the office from the corridor where I'd stepped to take Eleanor's call, with the expression of someone who has just been handed empty space where something real was supposed to arrive. One evening, after a particularly brief and redirected call, Diane said nothing for a moment. Then she asked one question. It was not therapeutic. It was precise in the way only questions from people who have been watching you carefully can be precise. You've walked me through 6 promotions in 20 minutes. How long did she stay on the phone for the first one? 4 minutes. I said it before I had finished the thought. And then I sat with the fact that I knew the exact duration, not an estimate, not an approximation, the exact length. I had been measuring without meaning to for a very long time, and the measuring had filled a column I had not known I was keeping. Things seen by another person become real in a different way than things held privately. Diane had handed me a place to put it. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the beginning of something. On March 22, 2025, the Jones and Caldwell families gathered at Fort Belvoir for Tristan's formal captain pinning ceremony. I was 49 years old, a brigadier general commanding a joint cyber intelligence division at Fort Meade, and I had been wearing this uniform for 27 years. I drove down alone in my dress blues and had decided before I left Fort Meade that morning, without deliberating over it, that I would sit in the back row. That was where I sat at family events. That was the arrangement, and I had been maintaining it so long it no longer felt like an arrangement. It felt like common sense. Eleanor intercepted me in the lobby before I reached the auditorium. The room around us was full of Tristan's peers, colleagues, and family members. The lobby had the quality of ceremony spaces in the moments before they became official, people finding their seats, conversations kept low, everyone performing a version of composure they would relax later. Eleanor stepped toward me near the entrance. She took my arm. She leaned close, and she delivered the sentence quietly and precisely, the way you deliver something you have considered. Don't disgrace us today. This is Tristan's moment, not yours. I held her eyes for one full beat. I said nothing. I found my seat in the back row. I was a brigadier general. I had commanded joint operations across multiple theaters, briefed 4 stars in rooms where the temperature of what you said mattered enormously, and wore this uniform for 27 years without a day of disgrace on my record. And my mother, at 74 years old, still needed to remind me to stay in my lane at a ceremony where I'd already chosen the back row before she asked. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her. I went and sat down because that habit ran so deep I didn't feel it as a habit. I felt it as common sense. The ceremony opened with military formality. Lieutenant General Marcus Reeves, 09, 3 stars, my mentor from Cyber Command, dating back to 2002, when I was a captain, and he was already a senior presence in the intelligence architecture, stood at the front of the auditorium. Reeves was among the Army's most senior cyber intelligence officers by 2025, the kind of institutional figure whose presence at a captain's pinning said something specific about the regard he held for the officer being honored. He administered the oath, cleanly and formally. He pinned captain's bars on Tristan's collar. Tristan stood composed and professional, the product of genuine training and genuine effort. Eleanor, from the 3rd row, reached over and squeezed Dennis's hand. The room was warm. The ceremony was clean and complete and right on its own terms. Tristan stood up there the way I always knew he could. Steady. He has our mother's jaw and 20 years of my letters, and he earned every inch of those bars. I was proud of him. That part was simple. The rest of the afternoon was not. Reeves finished the pinning. He took one step back. He paused. He turned his head toward the rows. The room went quiet in the way ceremony rooms go quiet between formal actions, a held breath, everyone waiting for whatever comes next. Then Reeves walked, deliberately, with no rush, down the center aisle. He passed the front rows. He passed the 3rd row, where Eleanor sat. He passed Tristan. He walked all the way to the back row, unhurried, and stopped at my seat. On your feet, General. I stood. Reeves walked back to the front, where a second velvet box had been waiting at the podium, and he read from the orders in a voice that was clear and carried to every corner of that room. By direction of the President of the United States, Brigadier General Sarah Jones is hereby promoted to the grade of Major General. The 2nd star went on to my collar. The room rose. He read the orders aloud. Every word. By direction of the President, the room was already standing by the time I had fully registered what was happening. I heard my mother make a sound behind me, something between breath and realization, the sound of a world reorganizing itself faster than a person can follow. I did not turn around. I held my position and let the room do what it was doing. Reeves had planned every element of this. The walk was deliberate, past Tristan, down the full length of the aisle, to the back row. He was not only honoring the promotion, he was making a statement about where I had been sitting. And the statement required the full length of that walk to be legible. The back row of my own family's esteem was named, without a word, by the act of going to get me out of it. I understood that. I think everyone in the room understood it, including Eleanor. Tristan turned to face me. He came to full attention with the precision of an officer who takes the physical language of the uniform seriously. He rendered a formal salute, the first salute of the post-ceremony assembly, from a captain to a major general, from a junior officer to a superior, from a younger brother to his older sister, who had written letters to him from every duty station for 20 years. He held it. He did not rush the duration. The photographer was still positioned from the ceremony. The frame captured the full assembly, frozen behind Tristan, an entire room at attention behind the salute of one man. He held that salute. He didn't rush it. The whole room was behind him, and they were all still, and I returned it as cleanly as I knew how, and I thought, he knew. He arranged this. He requested it weeks before and never said a word to me or to her. He stood in that uniform, and he made sure his sister was seen. 28 years old. He got it right. Eleanor did not stand with the room. Her expression did not resolve into pride or relief. It collapsed into something quieter and harder to name. Something that crossed her face briefly and then settled into a stillness I recognized as the precursor to departure. Dennis registered it immediately. He took her arm without speaking, with the practiced ease of a man who has managed these moments before. He walked her out, not quickly, not conspicuously, but steadily and without ceremony. He did not look at me. He did not stop. The door swung closed behind them. The rest of the room remained standing. Dennis has always known when to leave. I watched the door swing closed and I turned back to the room. 2 stars, 27 years, back row seat. Some things take up the whole room to make it visible. This was one of them. 20 minutes after the ceremony ended, Tristan found me near my car in the Fort Belvoir parking area. He was still in dress uniform, the new captain's bars catching the afternoon light on his collar. He walked up without a preamble, the way he always approached things he had decided to say, directly, without a warm-up, because he had already done his deliberating before he arrived. He told me he had submitted the joint ceremony request to Lieutenant General Reeves's staff 6 weeks prior. He had wanted me recognized at the same event. He had not told Eleanor, he had not told me. He made the decision alone, calculated that Reeves would honor it, given their existing institutional relationship through me, and then waited, 6 weeks of waiting, through the logistics and the family arrangements and his mother's lobby, whisper, to see it through. I put in the request 6 weeks ago. I wanted you there, not in the back row. I said, you should have told me. He said, you would have told me not to. He wasn't wrong. I would have told him to leave it alone. I would have said it was his day, not mine, and that I didn't need anything added to it on my behalf, and I would have been performing the same role I had been playing for 30 years, say, without recognizing it as performance. He knew that. He had been watching longer than I gave him credit for. We stood in that parking lot for a few more minutes in the afternoon light, 2 officers in dress blues with new insignia between us, and then we each got into our separate cars and drove back to our separate duty stations. I did not know yet how long the road from that parking lot was going to be. I drove back to Fort Meade alone. 2 hours, no music. Interstate 95 unspooling northward while the afternoon light shifted and the ceremony moved further behind me. I thought about the lobby. I thought about 30 years of adjusting, filing, staying in the back row, choosing the back row before anyone pointed to it, because that was where I had been trained to believe I belonged in the context of that family. The promotion was not the revelation. The promotion was the occasion. The revelation was how deep the habit ran, that I had walked into that building with 1 star on my collar and gone directly to the back row, without being asked, without hesitating, because it was simply what I did. I had not even considered sitting elsewhere. I had walked in, read the room, and calibrated to my assigned position in the family's hierarchy of importance before Eleanor said a word. The stars didn't feel new. The silence did. I drove 2 hours without the radio, and I thought about every single time I had made myself smaller in that family. Every call I'd abbreviated, every achievement I'd mentioned sideways and quickly and in a way that asked nothing of the listener. Every back row I'd chosen before anyone pointed to it. It was a long list. I had not been keeping it deliberately. My body had, apparently, been keeping it for me, cataloging each instance without my instruction, the way the body keeps records of things the mind decides not to examine. Arriving at Fort Meade that evening, I sat in my car for 10 minutes before going inside. I didn't go back and look at those records all at once. It was too many entries for a single evening, but I knew they were there now, and I knew I was going to have to account for them. A week passed. 2 weeks passed. Eleanor did not call. I did not call. My historical pattern, the pattern I had maintained for 27 years without exception, was to reach out within 48 hours of any family event, to smooth, to check in, to perform the labor of emotional maintenance that kept the family's communication functioning and that I had always provided, and that no one had ever acknowledged as labor because it had always simply appeared. I broke the pattern without announcing it. I simply did not call, and I watched the silence rather than filling it. I noticed that Eleanor hadn't called either. Both of us were waiting for me to do the work. I just stopped. And the silence had a shape to it I hadn't expected, not empty, but informative. It told me something about the architecture of what we had been doing, about who the structure depended on, and what happened when that person stepped back from holding it up. The silence wasn't anger. It was clear. I wasn't withdrawing to punish Eleanor. I was withdrawing to find out whether the relationship existed without my labor holding it up. That was a question I had never tested before, and I found I was genuinely curious about the answer. I didn't call her. That had never happened. Not once in 27 years had I let a family event pass without a follow-up call within 2 days, and I noticed, sitting in my quarters at Fort Meade, watching the phone not ring, that she wasn't calling either. We had both been waiting for me to do the work. I just stopped, and the silence had a shape to it I hadn't expected. In April, I sat down with Diane in the officers' dining facility after hours and told her what happened at the ceremony. Not the promotion. Diane already knew about the promotion, the way these things travel through a command. I told her about the lobby, the exact words, Eleanor's hand on my arm. The specific instruction was delivered quietly in a room full of other people, the back row I had chosen before she asked me to. Diane listened without interrupting for several minutes, her coffee going cold in front of her, her expression the particular expression of someone who was confirming something they had already suspected. Then she asked one question. How many years have you been apologizing for existing in that family? 27 years in this uniform, and not once, not in a command billet, not in a briefing with 4 stars in the room, not in a joint operation with personnel from 3 other branches who had competing agendas and competing authorities, had I been told to make myself smaller. There was exactly one place in my life where that instruction was standard and expected and delivered without apology. It was the last place I had expected to see it named out loud by someone else. I sat with Diane's question for the remainder of that evening and for several days after it, turning it over, examining it from the angles that were uncomfortable, putting it back down, picking it up again. It was a precise question. Precision is a courtesy. Tristan called at the end of April. He told me Eleanor had asked him 3 times whether I was angry, and he was reporting this directly, not relaying her question on her behalf. He made the distinction explicit, and I appreciated that he made it. I told him I wasn't angry. I was just not calling right now. He asked if I knew how long it was right now. I told him I didn't yet. He said he understood, and I believed him, because Tristan has a quality of understanding that doesn't require more information than you've given him. He said he was proud of me. I told him to focus on his duty assignment. He said yes, ma'am, and he meant it with full sincerity and no irony. He didn't push. He accepted the answer and moved on. In our family, that was a rare thing. 6 weeks after the ceremony, I still had not called Eleanor. The absence had begun to create friction in the family's familiar architecture, and Eleanor was not accustomed to being the one who waited. She had never, in my memory, been the one who waited. The architecture of our family's communication had been built on the assumption that I would be available when needed, and that my availability was not something that required acknowledgement because it had never been withheld. Now it was being withheld, and the structure was showing the places where it had always depended on that single load-bearing element. Dennis sent me a text first. Not a call, a text, 3 sentences, which told me he had thought carefully about what medium was appropriate for what he wanted to say. The choice of text over call was itself a kind of consideration, a decision to give me space to receive the communication on my own timeline rather than requiring an immediate response. He did not apologize for Eleanor. He did not ask me to call. He acknowledged that the ceremony had been unexpected and that Eleanor was still processing what had happened. He ended with, he hoped things were good with me. It was the longest direct communication he had ever sent me in 25 years of being my stepfather, and I read it 3 times before I replied. What happened at the ceremony wasn't something she handled well. She's still working through it. I hope things are good with you. 3 sentences. 25 years as my stepfather, and that was the most he had ever said directly to me about anything that mattered in the architecture of our family. I wrote back, "Things are good, thank you, Dennis." That was the entirety of our exchange. It was more than we had managed in 2 decades, and it told me something about Dennis that I had suspected but never confirmed. That he understood more than he let on, that he was operating within constraints he had chosen and accepted, and that within those constraints he was capable of precision, when precision was what the moment required. Eleanor attempted contact through Tristan 3 separate times. Each time, Tristan called me and was immediately transparent. He reported that she had asked, stated plainly that he was not asking on her behalf, and held that position without elaboration or apology. He had decided where he stood before he picked up the phone, and he communicated it with the same directness he brought to everything. "She's asked me 3 times. I'm telling you she asked. I'm not asking on her behalf. That's where I stand." 28 years old, and he already understood something it took me until 49 to stop doing. Eleanor's first instinct under pressure was to use an intermediary. It had been the family's primary communication strategy for difficult situations for the entire span of my adult life. Tristan's refusal to participate was a boundary he did not announce, did not negotiate, and did not apologize for. He simply declined and reported that he had declined. I thanked him for being straight with me. He said that was just how he operated. I believed him. There was something that settled in me when I recognized that he had arrived at this on his own, not because I had modeled it for him or told him this was the right approach, but because he had watched the family's dynamics long enough to understand how they worked and decided he wasn't going to participate in the parts that weren't honest. He arrived at that independently. That meant something. At Fort Meade, I chaired my regular morning briefings with the same preparation and authority they always received. One morning in late April, walking back down the corridor from the conference room, I paused outside my office door and took a quiet inventory of how the room had behaved around me for the preceding hour. The briefings sharpened when I entered. Officers straightened. The conversation organized itself around my authority with the reflexive precision of people who understood the rank structure and had internalized what it meant. This was not arrogance. It was 27 years of earned institutional recognition. And it was the professional reality I moved through every single day without pausing to register it, because it was simply the environment. What I was registering now, for the first time with any clarity, was the size of the gap between that environment and the one I stepped into when Eleanor called. In every room at Fort Meade I walked into, the room adjusted. In my mother's presence, I adjusted. I had been doing that so long, I stopped noticing it was a choice. What was new was holding both facts in the same moment and seeing the split clearly for what it was. Not a personality quirk, not a family dynamic that was simply the way all families worked, but a specific and deliberate diminishment I had been consenting to without ever explicitly agreeing to it. 5 weeks after the ceremony, I called Raymond, my biological father, age 74, retired in North Carolina. We talked for 90 minutes. He asked about the work and the promotion and the scope of what I was now responsible for. He asked about the division and the people under my command and what the cyber intelligence landscape looked like from the inside of it. He asked good questions and listened to the full answers and did not redirect. At the end of that part of the conversation, he said, 2 stars, I always knew. He said it plainly and then moved to the next subject, the way you do when you have stated a fact and the fact is complete and requires no embellishment. He said it, and then he didn't walk it back or qualify it or add an asterisk or a however or a but. I always knew. No addendum. I wrote it down on a notepad while we were still on the phone, picked up a pen and wrote it without interrupting the conversation, just pressed the words onto the paper while Raymond kept talking, and later I found the notepad and looked at what I had written and thought. That's what I've been trying to hear for 29 years. Not the promotion, not the rank. I always knew. Eleanor called directly in late May. Not through Tristan. her name appearing on my screen, her phone, a direct call. I picked up the phone. I watched it ring. I counted the rings. There were 6 of them. She did not leave a voicemail. Later that evening, Tristan texted to ask if I'd seen the call. I confirmed I had. He asked if I was calling back. I said not today. He didn't push, which told me he had already anticipated that answer and had called not to advocate but simply to check in, to remain present without requiring anything from the check-in. That was him! 6 rings. I counted. She didn't leave a message, which told me she wasn't ready to speak into silence only to a person who answered. She was still expecting the terms to be the old terms, that I would receive the call, that I would smooth whatever needed to be smoothed, that the pattern would resume because the pattern had always resumed. I was working out what came after the pattern. With me no longer available at the end of a phone she expected to be answered, Eleanor's world lost an anchor she had not known she was using. Through Tristan's periodic, transparent updates, always offered voluntarily, never extracted from him, I learned that Eleanor had become quieter in the household, less central in the family's social calendar. She had mentioned my name to extended family members more than once, unprompted, not asking for anything, simply placing me in the sentence as though running an inventory of people who existed and checking that I was still on the list. The mentions were not accompanied by requests or complaints or explanations. They were just mentions. My name in a sentence, Sarah this, Sarah that, in conversations where my name had rarely appeared before, because I had rarely been the subject. Tristan told me she had said my name twice in family conversations, not asking, not directing, just mentioning, like she was taking stock. I noted it and kept moving, because a mention is not a change and 2 mentions are not a pattern. But I kept listening. In June, Tristan visited on a weekend pass. We had lunch near Fort Meade at a civilian restaurant where neither of us was in uniform and neither of us was anybody in particular. He asked a professional question about the path to major selection, not a general inquiry, a specific one about the timing of the evaluation board relative to duty assignment history and how a board would read a record with his particular arc. It was the question of someone who had already been thinking carefully about the answer and wanted a real one rather than a reassuring one. I gave him a real answer. We talked about his current assignment, my division's operational scope, the parts of the career we both found genuinely interesting, as opposed to the parts we did, because they were necessary, and because necessary is its own kind of value. At the end of lunch, unprompted, he said, "I didn't know it could be like this." I asked what he meant. He said, "Just this," talking without the whole thing in the background. I understood what he meant by the whole thing. He didn't need to name it. The whole thing was the performance that our family required, the careful navigation of Eleanor's attention, the management of what got said and to whom, the ambient awareness of who was being positioned where in the family's unofficial hierarchy of importance. Without it, we were just 2 people who had known each other for 29 years, one of them a major general and one of them a captain, and both of them interested in the same institution, for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone else. That was the best conversation we'd had in 20 years. No audience, no asterisk, just 2 Army officers eating lunch and talking straight. It was so simple I didn't know what to do with it at first. Diane commented on a change she said she had been observing for 2 months. She brought it up at the end of a long day when we were both still in the office and had briefly stopped to talk in the corridor outside my door. She didn't call it happiness. She was too precise for a word that was imprecise. She said I seemed less compressed, like someone who had set down something that was taking up room they had stopped noticing was occupied. The occupied room, that was the right way to put it. I had been carrying something in a room in my attention that I hadn't known was a room until it began to empty. "You look like someone who stopped carrying something." I said, "I put it down. I didn't throw it away." There is a difference between those 2 things, and the difference matters. Putting something down is an acknowledgement that it was real and had weight. It says, "This existed, I held it, I am setting it here, rather than there." Throwing something away is a different decision. It says this is finished, this has no further claim on me. I hadn't made that decision. I was still in the middle of determining what I was going to do with what I had set down, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise to seem resolved before I was. In July, Dennis called directly. Not a text this time, a full call, his voice on the line after a 25-year practice of conducting our relationship primarily through Eleanor's presence and the occasional brief exchange at family gatherings. He asked how I was doing. I told him honestly. I was fine, I wasn't angry, I was in need of time. He said he understood. He did not use Eleanor's name once in the entire call. He asked one question before we ended. Did I know that Tristan had arranged the joint ceremony? I said yes. Tristan had told me the afternoon of the ceremony. Dennis said, good. One word, with a particular quality to it, not a filler word, not a placeholder. A verdict. One word. We both knew what it covered. In 25 years, that was probably the most honest exchange Dennis and I had ever had, and it consisted of a single syllable. I had a more accurate understanding of Dennis after that call than I had developed across 2.5 decades of proximity. He approved of what Tristan had done. He had been waiting to know whether I knew. Now he knew that I knew, and he said good, and that was the whole thing. Near the end of July, Tristan called with his unit assignment still pending final orders. Near the end of the call, he added something that was clearly something he had decided to include rather than something that came up. Eleanor had been asking about me in a different way over the preceding weeks. Not that she is angry, not have you heard from her, not what she says when you talk, but what she is working on. How many people fall under her command? What does cyber intelligence work actually involve on a day-to-day basis? Tristan had been answering those questions in detail. He offered this as information, clearly, not as a brief on Eleanor's behalf or an argument for anything. He was reporting what he had observed, the way he reported everything. She asked me what your day-to-day looks like. I told her. She listened to the whole answer. I had been a brigadier general for 5 years, and she had never once asked that question. 4 months into being a major general, and she was asking Tristan what my days looked like. Different isn't the same as changed, and changed isn't the same as enough, but it was a data point worth noting. I kept listening. The second visit came in mid-July. Tristan drove up on a weeknight, and we went to dinner at a quiet restaurant near Fort Meade, neither of us in uniform. He had called 2 days earlier to ask if I was free, and I had said yes, without checking my calendar, which was itself something new. I had spent so many years managing my availability around what the family required of me that the simple act of saying yes, without first calculating the cost, was something I noticed. We sat across from each other in an ordinary restaurant and talked for 2 hours, and nobody needed to be managed. We talked about his teenage years, not in the way that family members sometimes revisit adolescence with a gloss of nostalgia over the difficult parts, but directly, the way Tristan approached things he had already thought through. He told me about things he had noticed during those years that I hadn't known he was tracking. He told me about specific visits I had made, specific things I had said, specific moments from phone calls he had apparently stored with a precision I hadn't expected. He was matter-of-fact about it, the way he was matter-of-fact about most things, which made it hit differently than if he had been emotional about it. He wasn't performing something. He was just reporting what he remembered. He told me that when he was 12, he read my letters so many times the paper got soft. I didn't respond right away. I looked at my coffee. I said, good. The paper got soft. He read them that many times. I ordered a second coffee, and I thought about 12-year-old Tristan at the table in the Virginia house, a letter from Fort Huachuca in his hands, reading my handwriting until the paper started to give at the folds. I had wondered across all those years of letters and postcards and Sunday calls whether any of it was reaching him the way I intended, or whether it was absorbed into the general noise of a household with too many competing frequencies and a mother who moved on quickly. It reached him. He kept the letters. He had not told me this before, and he was telling me now over a plate of food in civilian clothes on a Tuesday evening, and I said good, because it was the right word, and because sometimes the right word is the only thing you have. I did not say anything else for a long moment, and he did not require me to. Later in the summer, in August, he asked me directly what I planned to do about Eleanor. Not how I felt, not whether I was ready, what I planned. I appreciated the specificity of the question. I told him I didn't know yet, but I knew what I wouldn't do, and I knew what I would require if I resumed contact. I wouldn't return to the previous arrangement. If I called her, or if I answered when she called, it would be on terms I had thought through carefully and was prepared to hold without negotiating. If she calls, she talks about my life, she asks, and she stays on the subject. If she pivots, I end the call. That's the deal. He said, that's fair. He didn't say she'd meet it. He didn't say she couldn't. He said it was fair, which was the correct response, an evaluation of the standard rather than a prediction about whether it would be satisfied. That was the only thing I needed from him at that moment. I called Raymond that same month and told him, briefly and directly, what had happened at the ceremony and what had followed in the months since. Raymond is not someone who interrupts. He waited until I had said what I had to say, and then he responded to the whole of it, rather than to the individual pieces. At the end, he said, "You've always been what they couldn't hold. The uniform just made it official." I wrote it down on the notepad that was sitting on my desk. I write things down when I need them to be somewhere I can find them again, when I don't trust memory to hold something without losing its edges. I wrote it down, and I looked at it a few times over the following weeks, and I thought, that is the most accurate thing anyone has said to me about my own life in a very long time. Not flattering, accurate. Tristan turned 29 on August 14th. I called him early, before he would have started his morning physical training, because I had been calling him on his birthday early for 29 years, and I wasn't going to change that. That same month, I formally agreed to serve as his professional mentor through the Army Officer Development Pipeline. I introduced him to Diane Marsh as a secondary resource, Diane, who had been watching my career from the next office for 2 years, and who had the kind of institutional knowledge and professional precision that would serve Tristan well at this stage of his development. I told him what I would offer and what I expected in return. This was not a favor, and I did not frame it as one. It was not the kind of relationship that was shaped by favor. It was an investment I was making because he had earned it. Not because Eleanor had organized it, not because family obligation required it, but because this young captain had stood in that auditorium and held that salute for the full duration and shown me, without a word, exactly what kind of officer and what kind of person he was. I told him, "I'm in your corner because you earned it." Not because of who asked, not because of what the family expects, because you stood at attention in that auditorium and held that salute, and that told me everything I needed to know about who you are in this uniform. You want this, you do the work, and I'll be here. That's the whole deal. Eleanor called again in late August. I picked up the phone. I held it for 10 seconds, not answering, not declining, just holding the phone in my hand for 10 seconds and allowing myself to be deliberate rather than automatic. Then I set it down. It went to voicemail. She left a message this time, which was different from the last call in late May when she had rung 6 times and hung up. "I'd like to talk when you're ready. No rush." I played it once. I didn't call back, but I didn't delete it either. I left it in the inbox and it sat there for 10 days, patient, not demanding anything, which was itself a change in register from how she had communicated with me across the span of my life. No rush was 2 words I had not previously heard from her in this context. I noted them. I let the voicemail sit. By September of 2025, 6 months had passed since the ceremony. My life had reorganized itself around the space I had made by stopping the labor I had been performing for 3 decades. The professional work was sharp and clear. Tristan was settled in his duty assignment and in his relationship with me. Raymond was a regular call now, bi-weekly usually, sometimes more. Eleanor was in the inbox, waiting, her voicemail undeleted, not demanding anything. On an early September morning, I sat with my coffee before the day's briefings began and took a quiet accounting of the preceding 6 months. The silence had held. Tristan was well. Raymond had called twice since August. The professional work was sharper than it had been in a long time, which I attributed partly to having set down something that had been occupying room in my attention without my awareness. The ambient vigilance of being available, the constant low-level monitoring of what the family might need, the way that obligation had lived at the edge of my attention for so many years that I had stopped registering it as a separate thing from simply being myself. I had read 2 books that had been stacked on my nightstand for months. I had left the office at a reasonable hour on several consecutive evenings. I had slept without the low-grade vigilance that I hadn't known I was carrying until it began to lift. 6 months. I knew when I had started counting, and I couldn't tell you exactly what I was counting toward. What I knew was what I wouldn't go back to. What I didn't know yet, and this surprised me, was what I wanted instead. Those are different questions, and the second one is harder. I had spent 6 months becoming clear about what I would not accept. I had not yet spent enough time determining what I hoped for, if anything. Those are not the same question, and pretending they are is how people end up mistaking the removal of something painful for the presence of something good. Diane and I had lunch in September at our regular spot in the officers' dining facility, the table in the corner that we had claimed by habit over the course of 2 years. She watched me for a long moment before asking the question she had clearly been considering for a while. Did I actually think Eleanor was capable of it, of seeing me clearly, of asking about my life and staying on the subject and meaning the question she was asking? It was a more careful question than it might have appeared. It wasn't asking whether Eleanor was a good or bad person. It was asking about capacity, whether the thing I required was something Eleanor was structurally capable of providing. I took my time. I said I didn't know. I thought Eleanor might have been waiting for permission to try, which was its own kind of limitation and its own kind of explanation. She had spent 74 years in a particular configuration of herself, and reconfiguring that is harder than it sounds, and I didn't know whether she had the range for it or whether she was going to discover she did. It didn't excuse the lobby or the 12 minutes about the track meet or the 4-minute phone call after my first star. But it was probably true. She might have been waiting for permission, and I had never withheld it explicitly before, because I had never withheld the call before. The withholding itself might have been the clearest signal I had ever sent. Diane said that was a generous read. I said I knew. I was still working out whether I was comfortable with generous, and whether generous was the accurate word, or whether it was actually simply realistic that most people are not operating in bad faith most of the time, but are instead operating within the limits of what they have been able to see. Tristan's unit assignment was confirmed in September. He called with the news, and the relief in his voice was tangible. A settled quality, a professional anxiety resolved, the particular satisfaction of knowing where you're going next and having chosen it. Near the end of the call, he mentioned unprompted that Eleanor had been asking about me in a new way. Not that she is angry, not have you heard from her, not what did she say when you talked to her, but what is she working on? How many people does she command? What does cyber intelligence work actually involve on a day-to-day basis? Tristan had been answering in detail. He offered this neutrally, the way he offered all information that he thought I should have, but that he wasn't advocating about. She asked me what your day-to-day looks like. I told her. She listened to the whole answer. That was new. It was a small thing, and it wasn't a small thing at all. And I held both of those assessments simultaneously, without needing to resolve them into one. While reorganizing a box of old documents that same month, a box that had been sitting in the corner of my quarters since the last time I had moved, which was when I arrived at Fort Meade, which was 3 years ago, I found a photograph from my 1998 commissioning ceremony. I was in my dress uniform, the uniform of a brand new second lieutenant. Raymond was to my left. Eleanor was to my right. Eleanor was looking at the camera. Not at me, at the camera, at whoever would eventually see the photograph. At the record of her presence there. I stood with the photograph for a long time, in my quarters, on a September evening, with no particular obligation and no particular place to be. And I did not put it away. I left it on the counter. My mother was looking at the camera in every photograph she had ever taken at one of my ceremonies. I understood this as I stood there with that photograph from 1998. Every single one, the commissioning, the promotions, whatever had been photographed in the 27 years of a career she had attended in some form or another. She was there. She was present. She just wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the record of having been there, which is a different thing. I had never noticed until that September evening with a box of old documents and nowhere better to be. And I let the photograph sit on the counter overnight, and in the morning I looked at it again and thought, there it is. There it has always been. Late in September, driving home from Fort Meade at the end of a long day, I passed the gate sentry, returned the salute, and merged onto the highway. The commute was the same commute it had been for 3 years. The same highway, the same sequence of exits, the same landmarks going past in the same order. I thought about what Tristan said about Eleanor listening to the whole answer. I thought about the voicemail still sitting in my inbox, patient in a way she had not previously been. And I realized I had been managing the absence of Eleanor for 6 months. Managing the silence, making deliberate decisions about each ring and each text. But I had not yet decided what I would say if she called tomorrow. Not what I required. What I hoped for. The requirement was settled. The hope was not. I got home. I sat in the car for 2 minutes in my own driveway before going inside. The engine was off. The house was in front of me. I tried to finish the question, what do I hope for from this woman who is my mother? And I couldn't get to the end of it. Which told me I wasn't done yet, and that something was still coming, and that trying to force it into resolution before it was ready was the same kind of management I was trying to stop doing. I left it unfinished. I went inside. The question waited in the car with the keys in my pocket. On a Sunday evening in late September, Eleanor called. I saw her name on the screen. I picked up on the third ring, not the first, not the last, just the third. Where I landed when I was neither avoiding the call nor rushing to receive it. There was a pause on her end, the length of a held breath, the length of time it takes a 74-year-old woman who told her son she was nervous before she dialed to gather herself and begin. Then Eleanor said, I wanted to ask how you are. Not Tristan mentioned, not I've been thinking about calling, not any of the scaffolding she would usually erect before arriving at the actual subject. Just, how are you? She called on a Sunday. I almost didn't answer. 3 rings. I picked it up. She didn't say my name first, she just said I wanted to ask how you are, and something in me went quiet. Not suspicious. Quiet in a different way. The way a room goes quiet when the thing you've been waiting to hear is finally said. I stayed on the phone. Eleanor asked about the division, how many personnel fell under my command, what the cyber intelligence work involved at the level I was operating, and whether I traveled regularly for the role. She asked about the promotion and what came next in the career arc, what the 08 rank meant in practical terms. She asked what my weeks looked like on a typical day, what the early morning briefings covered, what the work felt like after 27 years of it. She did not pivot. She did not produce Tristan's name. She did not fill the line with anyone else's news. She stayed. 37 minutes. My actual life, my command, my work, the specific and concrete details of who I was and what I did, held her attention for 37 minutes without interruption. At the end, Eleanor said, I never really understood what cyber work meant. What you were doing, I'd like to understand it better. I said, I can explain it. I explained it. She asked a follow-up question, then another. She stayed with it, all 37 minutes, not once to someone else's news, just my work, my life, me. That had never happened before. I am not being dramatic. It had never, across 27 years of phone calls, happened once. She didn't apologize for the lobby. She did not reference the ceremony directly. I did not bring it up. This was a deliberate choice, because what I required was not an apology delivered on a specific timeline or in a specific form. What I required was the conversation we were having. The apology might come later. It might arrive in the accumulated weight of behavior maintained across many months. It might not come at all. For now, this was the data I had, and the data was sufficient for a first call. She didn't say I'm sorry for what I said in that lobby. I didn't ask her to. Some things get said on their own timeline or not at all. What I knew was she stayed on the subject. That was the requirement. She met it. That's where we were. One call, one standard met. Both of us on opposite ends of a phone line that had been going the same direction for 30 years, finally going both ways. After the call ended, I set the phone on the table. I sat in the quiet for a while, without naming what I felt. Then I texted Tristan 2 words. She called. He responded quickly. I know, she told me before she dialed. 3 dots. Then, she was nervous. I read the message twice. A 74-year-old woman had told her son she was nervous before calling her own daughter. That detail moved something in me that the 37-minute conversation alone had not fully reached. Not because the conversation wasn't real, but because the nervousness was. It meant she knew. On some level, she had always known what the stakes were, what had been missing, what she was being asked to attempt. She was nervous, 74 years old, and she told her son she was nervous before calling me. I sat with that for a long time, not with triumph, with something quieter, something closer to, oh, she knows. On some level, she has always known, and she was nervous. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. A few days later, October now, I walked the Fort Meade campus before 0600, before the day's briefings, in the kind of morning that had become autumn overnight, cool, clear, the light cutting low and long across the grounds in that specific way that October light has of arriving at an angle you don't expect, illuminating things from the side rather than from above. I passed the gate sentry. I returned the salute. I kept walking, the campus quiet around me, my pace the pace I had kept for 27 years of early mornings in uniform. I was thinking about nothing specific when I registered it. I was not bracing. No call I was dreading. No relationship I was managing, no performance I was warming up for. No corner of my attention held in readiness against the next thing that would need to be absorbed or smoothed or addressed before it became something larger. The vigilance I'd been carrying since I was 9 years old, that low-level, ambient readiness, that posture of a person who has learned to anticipate the next adjustment before it arrives, was simply not there. I was just walking, and the morning was just a morning, and the campus was just a campus, and the sentry at the gate was just a soldier doing his job, and none of it required me to be smaller than I was. I thought about Tristan, who held the salute. I thought about the way he didn't rush the duration, the way he let it be long enough to be real and not just formal, the way an entire room stood frozen behind him and he didn't rush for any of it. I thought about Raymond, who said 2 stars and left no asterisk, who had always known and had said so plainly and moved on. I thought about Eleanor, nervous on the phone the night before she dialed, telling her son before she called her daughter. I thought about the photograph on the counter, my mother looking at the camera, her presence without her gaze, 30 years of being there and not looking. And I thought about the back row, the seat I had chosen before anyone pointed to it, the muscle memory of diminishment, the habit that ran so deep I hadn't felt it running. I decided it was past tense now. Not a place I visited anymore, a place I used to live. I walked across that campus at 0600 and I wasn't bracing for anything. That sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. I had been bracing in that family since I was 9 years old, since the afternoon my father picked up the bag and walked out and I filed away the lesson that you leave quietly or you don't leave at all, and I hadn't known I was doing it every single day until the day I stopped. The stars on my collar were the same ones I'd worn the week before. The grass was the same, the sentry at the gate was the same. The morning light came from the same direction it always came from. I was not the same. The 37-minute phone call was not a resolution. It was a beginning, and I knew it was a beginning, and I held it as one. There would be more calls, and some of them would go well, and some of them might not. And Eleanor was 74 years old and had been operating from a particular configuration of herself for 7 decades. And that configuration does not rearrange itself cleanly in a single conversation. But she had been nervous before she dialed. She had listened to the whole answer. She had said, "I'd like to understand it better." And I had believed her in the moment she said it, and I was still inclined to believe her now. Standing on the Fort Meade campus in the October light with 2 stars on my collar and nothing to brace for. You can give everything to someone who isn't watching. Your time, your loyalty, your back row behavior, your Sunday calls, 27 years of staying small so their story has more room. The thing that saves you isn't being seen by them. It's the moment you stop needing them to. I didn't walk away from my family. I walked toward myself, and I stayed there long enough for the right people to have to come find me. Not everyone will. Some of them will. That's enough. I didn't get every answer I wanted, but I finally stopped shrinking just to keep the peace. If my story spoke to you, like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that their worth doesn't depend on being noticed. Have you ever had to stop carrying a relationship alone? When did you realize it was time to choose yourself? Tell me in the comments. I'd like to hear your story.